Ken Whiting with Paddle TV, and in this video we're going to talk about one of the things that provides the most challenges to any type of paddler, canoe or kayak or stand-up paddler, any paddler, and that's wind. Wind has a profound impact. Now let's start by making sure that everybody understands, like, wind is sometimes measured in knots per hour and miles per hour, kilometers per hour. And just so everybody's clear, 1 knot is 1.15 miles. 1 knot is also 1.85 kilometers. We're going to talk about miles per hour here, since the majority of the people watching this are in the US, but that's what you need to know. Now, as a general rule, anything more than 15 to 20 tops miles per hour, any wind more than that, is just, it's too much for kayaking. The seas get too rough, the water gets too rough, you're not going to be able to make headway, you'll just get beaten up too much. Obviously, your skill level will dictate whether or not you can handle 15 to 20 mile per hour winds, or whether even 5 to 10 mile per hour winds are more than enough for you to handle. On top of that, it's the bodies of water you're going to be paddling in. Large bodies of water are subject to waves when you have wind. And the size of the waves that are created they're dictated by the fetch, which is the length of water, the amount of water that is impacted by the wind before it reaches you. And so if you have a lot of water that the wind can come across, it's going to build up bigger and bigger and bigger waves. So the bigger the body of the water, the bigger the waves that you can get. And so if you're sticking to small bodies of water that are protected, they have shelter, maybe big trees or hills that are providing protection from the wind, then hey, there might be 15 mile per hour winds, but you're not actually being subjected to them, and there's no waves that are being created that are impacting you. Now, in order to understand the impact that wind has on your kayak, you first need to understand how your kayak travels through the water, and for that I've got my little model kayak here. So when you're traveling, a kayak is traveling through the water, and it's important to note that this applies to kayaks that have a bow keel that are designed. Most kayaks are designed with some type of bow keel to cut through the water. There are some kayaks, some inflatable kayaks, stand-up paddle boards that are just flat, big flat platforms up front. They're not going to cut through the water, and so this doesn't necessarily apply to those. But most kayaks, wreck kayaks, touring kayaks, sea kayaks, do have this feature. Now, when they're traveling through the water is hitting the bow of the kayak. And when it hits the bow of the kayak, it's effectively holding it in place, stopping it from moving back and forth. There's pressure there. And the water can hit the kayak all the way to the center point of the kayak, the widest point of the kayak. After that, the water isn't hitting from that widest point to the tail. And so that part of the kayak, it can move back and forth more freely. There's less pressure on it. And so that's why most of your steering for kayaks happens at the back of the boat. You're moving the back of the boat. Now, why is that important? That's important because let's talk about side winds or beam winds. If I'm traveling forward and I have a wind coming in from my right, it's hitting the kayak. Now the bow of my kayak is being held in place more than the stern, as we just identified. So that means when the kayak is being hit by the wind, the stern is going to be pushed downstream, downwind, more than the bow, which means that the kayak is going to turn into the wind. And that's something that's called weathercocking. And every kayak that has a bow keel weathercocks. It's going to naturally want to turn into the wind. So how do you prevent that from happening? Well, first of all, depending on the strength of the wind, it will happen at different rates. This can happen if you're dealing with a strong beam wind. Your boat's going to want to weathercock a lot. Your stern's going to get pushed aggressively downwind. And so you need something to hold that stern in place, and that's where rudders and skegs come in. And so I did a whole video about rudders and skegs, and I'll leave a link in the description box down below to it, because I'm not going to go into real depth there about which is better or do you need one and all that. But the bottom line is rudders and skegs, their main purpose is they drop down in the stern in order to help keep that stern from being pushed around as much, so when you're dealing with winds, you can keep your course. Because without it, you don't really have much choice. Your boat wants to turn into the wind, you're just gonna have to sweep harder on one side than the other side to correct for that. The other thing that you can actually do is tilt your kayak. When you tilt your kayak, and this applies to not big, wide boats that you can't really, recreational kayaks that you can't really hold on edge. This applies to more rec touring or touring kayaks or sea kayaks. Regardless if there's wind or not, when you tilt your kayak will naturally turn away from the way it's being tilted. And so that's another way to fight the effects of weathercocking. I have a beam wind coming in from this side. My kayak naturally wants to weathercock, turn into that wind. Well, if I tilt my kayak into that wind, that's going to counter the effects of the boat weathercocking, because now it wants to actually turn the other way. If you're doing that for a long period of time, it can be exhausting, just like sweeping on one side harder than the other. So that's when it makes sense to have a skeg, have a rudder instead, so that for long periods of time paddling in with a crosswind, a beam wind, side wind, whatever you want to call it, that you can keep going straight a lot more easily. So now let's talk about headwinds. Headwinds suck when you're paddling. They suck a lot more than rain, because you can paddle through rain, but what you can't do in rain is video and talk, especially when it's cold and rainy. So we have to change locations. I'll be right back. Okay, that feels better. It was getting cold and wet out there. So where was I? Headwind, and how much headwind sucks. That's what I was talking about. You know, going into a bit more depth than that though, here's some things to think about. An average paddler will paddle between, you know, at a sustained rate, will paddle between 2 to 4 miles per hour. It depends on what type of boat you're using, how fast and narrow it is, how good of a paddler you are, and how fit you are. But anyway, let's say that you paddle 3 miles per hour. That's a kind of a good average. This isn't an exact science, but let's say it roughly a 15 to 20 mile per hour headwind is going to cause enough resistance against you that it's going to slow you down by about 3 miles per hour. So if you paddle 3 miles per hour and you're paddling into a headwind of 15 to 20 miles per hour, which is causing 3 miles per hour of resistance, then you're not moving anywhere. There's no reason to be paddling in those conditions. You have to paddle harder than you normally do to make any headway. And so, well, what happens there? Let's say you paddle 33% harder than you normally paddle. That's actually really quite hard to paddle 33% harder than you normally do, and to sustain that for any period of time, that's a lot of work. Well, what does that get you? Well, 33% more than 3 miles per hour is another mile per hour. So you're going 4 miles per hour, but you still have 3 miles per hour of resistance against you. So your effective rate of travel is 1 mile per hour for a whole lot of effort that you probably can't sustain for very long. I mean, maybe you have to do it because you're in a situation where you don't have much choice, but in most cases, it's just not worth it. Now, let's take the scenario, same thing, you paddle at 3 miles per hour, but you have there's a lesser wind that impacts you by 2 miles per hour, that has 2 miles per hour worth of resistance. Now, if you're just paddling normal, you're only going to make headway at a rate of 1 mile per hour. But if you paddle 33% harder, you're now going 4 miles per hour, which is effectively moving you through the water 2 miles per hour. That's double the speed. That's 100% faster. So you're paddling 33% harder than you normally do, and that might be hard to sustain, but you're making 100% advance improvement on your rate of speed through the water. Taking that a bit further, okay, let's say you have even milder wind and it's only having a 1 mile per hour impact on your forward progression. So now you're actually traveling through the water at 2 miles per hour. Well, you put that 33% extra effort in, and that's going to move you 4 miles per hour, but minus 1 mile per hour of resistance. So now you're moving 3 miles per hour actually through the water at 3 miles per hour. So that 33% extra effort is only giving you a 50% boost. Is it worth it? You know what? I don't have the answer to that question, and I'm throwing a lot of numbers out here at you, but the whole idea is that when you're dealing with a headwind, you actually have to think of these things. You have to be running these things through your head to decide, what is my course of action? Is this worth it? I mean, in many cases, it's not. And in some cases, you just, hey, pack up, go find another place to paddle, or put the gear away and try again tomorrow. In other cases, it's, okay, yeah, it is worth it. I can make enough headway here, but it's going to be a grind, and I accept that. Or it might be, you know what? The fastest route to get from here to there is not actually from here to there against the headwind. It's to go over there first, and then I'm sheltered from the headwind, and then I can travel, up to my end point. So the fastest way might be doing 2 sides of the triangle instead of just the one side of the triangle. This is very big picture, rudimentary discussion about dealing with headwind and traveling in water. And this is the kind of stuff that you go into a lot more in depth when you take a sea kayaking course. And that's why I absolutely love sea kayaking courses, and I would encourage anyone who wants to take their paddling beyond just a paddle around a pond, a small lake, a little body of water, down a calm river. Take a sea kayaking course, take a whitewater kayaking course for that matter. It won't help you deal with wind, but helps you deal with current, because there's lots of other things to think about when you get into that world. So now let's talk about tailwinds. And there's not as much to talk about with tailwinds as there is with headwinds. Tailwinds tend to be the friendly winds. They're going to give you the boost instead of the brakes. And the only real thing to know about tailwinds is that depending on the body of water you're on, they can be accompanied by waves. And those waves can be your friends as well. They can give you a good boost. You can surf waves, wind waves, and you get the benefit of the wave, benefit of the wind, tailwind, and you can travel incredibly fast downwind that way. But something else to know about tailwinds and waves that come behind you is when you don't see the waves coming from behind you, it has the potential of resulting in seasickness. You don't get seasick nearly as often when you're paddling into waves, but when you don't see them coming and your body's surprised by the motion, that's where seasickness tends to creep up on paddlers. And it doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. I mean, I've felt it coming on myself, and I've had to, turn into the wind and watch the waves coming in and watch the horizon and bring myself down. It can happen. So now, some other things to talk about when it comes to paddling in wind. For one thing, areas typically have some pretty standard or common wind themes. For example, where we are right here, we're in Hood River, Oregon in the Columbia Gorge, and the winds are very predictable in that they rush from west to east up the gorge. And that's what you can expect, and you have to plan around that. In many areas, it's also the time of day that the wind picks up. At the end of the day, the wind is going to tend to be, in the afternoon, it'll tend to get windier and windier, and at the end of the day, it can subside. And it really depends on where you are, and it's really important to know those themes and to plan around them. But on top of that, you don't want to just to take the general themes in this and make the assumption that that's going to be what it's like today. There are some other tools you can use, and there's a great app called Windy, which can show you the wind forecast and what the wind's like now, and an hourly forecast. I think it is anywhere in the world, and it's incredibly for a weather app, it's quite reliable. Another consideration is when you're paddling in the wind, if you do go for a swim, the wind is moving the top layer of the water, and it's moving stuff on top of the water very fast. So when you go for a swim, you're not on the top layer of the water. I mean, you're a little bit in the top layer, but you're going to be still. Your boat and paddle is going to get blown downwind way faster than you are. And that's really important to know, because it means if you flip and you go for a swim, you need to grab hold of your boat and paddle in windy conditions right away, or before you know it, they're gone and there's no way you're going to catch them. That's also why in windy conditions, it's essential that you're paddling with people, and people you can count on, because they are going to be your lifeline and you're going to be their lifeline. The last thing to mention about paddling in wind, and you know what, it doesn't really just apply to paddling in wind, it applies to just paddling in general, but wind can be the biggest reason that your plans get messed up, that you can't get to where you plan to, or you can't get back to where you started from. You can't get back to your vehicle. And that's why it's so important that you have a communication device on hand, and a reliable one. Something, hey, you gotta know, is there cell service in this area? Is it reliable cell service? If it's not, well, you need another communication device. You also need to leave a float plan with somebody so that they know where you're going, they know what the plan is, and they know where to look for you if you don't show up, if you don't come back in time. Anyway, paddling in wind it really is a challenging thing. The windier it gets, the more exposed the waters you're paddling in, the bigger an issue it is. If you like the idea of pushing yourself in more exposed conditions, paddling in rougher water, or just being able to paddle in water that, hey, you don't want to paddle in the wind, but you appreciate the fact that it's a place that's subject to strong winds and they could come up during the day and surprise you, and you'll have to deal with those conditions. If you want to paddle in those scenarios, then you really, really, really need to take a sea kayaking course and get the skills, not just get the skills to deal and plan around wind, but get the self-rescue skills that you need to deal with the accidents, the stuff that'll pop up, capsizes. There's an incredible amount of confidence and comfort that comes from gaining that knowledge, gaining the expertise that those self-rescue techniques provide. And so I highly recommend it. I hope you guys have enjoyed this tip. Stay tuned, lots more tips coming your way. Leave a comment down below, as always, if there's anything you have to add about paddling in wind. And we'll see you again for another tip, gear review, or paddling adventure.